Hey guys, time for the week in review where we take a deep breath and a step back from the news and see what themes from the week illuminate the world around us. And this was such an interesting week in news. And so I'm going to wrap a little bit of the personal with the professional again this week to talk a little bit about what we've seen in the news and also what we can learn from that. The commemoration of D-Day in World War II was one of the major news items of the week. It's the reason why President Trump was in Europe and he had these series of meetings that we covered. But the profound nature of the D-Day event is something that we all paused to reflect on this week. And I did as well. You know, I've talked about the fact that I'm married to a combat veteran, but I didn't always have a connection to the military. In fact, the one connection that I had was through my grandfather, who is a war correspondent for the Associated Press. And he was in Europe during the war before D-Day. When D-Day happened, he actually was back in San Francisco, where he helped set up and run the San Francisco Associated Press Bureau for many, many years. And in fact, because of you guys, thank you very much, I did a little bit more research and I saw what article he published on D-Day in 1944. And it was based on his experience overseas, seeing the weaponry that Nazi Germany had used in war. Remember, when we faced off against Nazi Germany in Normandy, France, they had superior firepower and experience. The odds were not always in our favor, but the United States and our allies, we were able to overcome that. And that was one of the most significant parts of the day, of which there are many significant parts. But one of the things we talked about this week, if you saw on our website, is that for many Americans, we knew that the invasion was happening on June 6, 1944. The news was telling us that, but what that really meant, we didn't know. And in fact, it took us many days, maybe a week, 10 days, to get the real sort of firsthand eyewitness experience from journalists, because part of their responsibility as journalists was to submit their work to the US government so it could be censored before it would be published. And the reason for that was to not give away too much information. One of my most prized possessions I have is a copy of my grandfather's War Correspondent Associated Press handbook. And as I was flipping through that a couple years ago, I stumbled upon a really interesting page about censorship. And it impacted the way that I thought about journalism and still think about journalism, and also how I think about SmartHER news. And so this is just a small paragraph, the censorship of articles for publication. Here's the 4 points that were covered for censorship. In general, articles may be released for publication to the public provided they are accurate in statements and implication, they do not supply military information to the enemy, they will not injure the morale of the forces, the people at home, or our allies. They will not embarrass the United States, its allies, or neutral countries. So think about that for a second. The articles had to be accurate. They could not supply military information to the enemy. They could not injure the morale of soldiers or the American public or our friends. And they will not embarrass the United States. Think about that. That was only 75 years ago. But that's what journalists had to follow if they were going to be embedded, like my grandfather, who was embedded with British forces off the coast of Italy as British forces were facing off against Germany there. And so how would one go around reporting the news if you had to follow all those rules, you might ask? Well, here's an example of an article that my grandfather wrote. And I want you just to sort of listen to a couple of these paragraphs to what he's describing and think about whether or not it actually follows the rules and regulations of that day. So this is what it starts off with. Aboard a British cruiser off eastern Sicily, July 11th. Caught flat-footed by the Allied invasion of Sicily, the Germans bounced back, and since 4 p.m. yesterday have subjected this ship and other warships and the great assault convoy to violent and persistent attacks. A barrage was thrown up by the convoy, and the warships quickly made the whole bright afternoon sky a crazy quilt of black and white patches as the shells burst high and low. The bombers plummeted into the sea, one in a vertical dive from 10,000 feet, leaving only a small oil patch to mark its sea grave. Apparently, none of the ships was hit by bombs. Several disappeared momentarily beneath spray showering from near misses, but emerged triumphantly with their guns still blazing. The first alarm was still progressing at 4:15 p.m. when messmen appeared with big cans of hot tea, which the thirsty men eagerly gulped at their action stations. What a description of what actually was happening. And it reminded me of the priority in journalism, that for the longest time, and really we've moved away from that, the priority of journalism was to bring someone to a place that they've never been, to put them in the moment, because if you could accurately describe that moment and that feeling, the way that people looked, the smell in the air, that you would provide them the opportunity to make up their own minds on different issues, because it was like they were there. And as I was reflecting on my grandfather's work, I had two observations of this week's news just to think about as we move on to another big week that's going to, for sure, deliver a lot of big news items as well. One is on journalism and one is on the actual news sources. So think about, when you look at the news, how much it is lacking description, like we saw in World War II. Think about how we talk so much about different events, but you really have no idea what's going on. Do you ever get that feeling? Like, I know that happened, but I have no idea what that means. An example being this week is that there's a big story brewing between Mexico and the United States and the southern border. There's a lot of anonymous sources about what's happening and deals being made, but very little description about what's happening in the room. Who had the fifth cup of coffee, who stepped out for a cigarette break, who's loosening their tie. The atmosphere and the description really matters in journalism, and there's a lack of it. It's one of the reasons why I think podcasting is really big right now, because it requires a certain level of description sometimes in conversation that you don't get daily in the news. The second thing that I was thinking about comes to the sort of stories that we're seeing. There's so much emphasis on the federal government these days, and World War II, the D-Day anniversary, reminded me of the reason why. Oftentimes people say, it's just the welfare state, and the American public is so used to just depending on Uncle Sam. That might be true, but in certain instances like war, like World War II, we had to turn to the federal government. The federal government showed its strength through the military and the importance in national security. The federal government is really important for the average American citizen when it comes to these big issues like war, big issues like immigration. And so it's not just that we're all just blindly turning to the federal government. It's that as we've grown as a country, we've seen the role that the federal government can play. However, it is important to know what's happening on a state level. And as I looked at different stories over the last 2 to 3 weeks, I saw how much movement in these stories is happening at a state level, but it's not happening in the federal government. Let me give you a couple of examples. The serious nature of abortion laws in America, a lot of movement on a state level. The sort of regular nature of traffic laws, like red light cameras. You have gun laws, quote unquote red flag laws that we covered this week on SmartHER News. There's movement on the state level there. Even movement about drugs. You have Denver and Oakland, 2 American cities that are decriminalizing the use of magic mushrooms. That's not happening on a federal level, but it's happening on a local and then a state level, something to watch. So oftentimes when we look and think, well, wow, there's no progress being made on these big issues, it's important to differentiate between whether progress is being made on the federal level or being made on the state level. Whether or not you like the progress or the movement that we're seeing is another topic, but it is happening. There are things happening on a state level that are really important to recognize. Finally, 75 years ago isn't that long ago. 75 years ago, to know that the invasion of France was just taking place just now. D-Day was one event. For journalists and for soldiers, the fighting continued for almost another entire year before the Germans surrendered. And the fighting was brutal, not just on D-Day, but for so many months that followed. And think of all that's happened in 75 years. Think of what's happened to journalism. Think what's happened on a national security level, whether it's going into Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Think of all the conflicts we've had. Think of the technology that was developed. My grandfather earned the name Lucky Lee because during the bombings that he was on this British ship, he was able to make sure that his typewriter still worked. Now I'm talking to you as a journalist through my handheld phone. 75 years is an incredible time period of progress in so many different ways. And that makes me think about what's going to happen in the next 75 years for all of us. All of this experience with my grandfather, reflecting on the news cycle, is the reason why I started SmartHER News. And this idea about morale, not providing information to people just to make them feel good, but knowing that if you provide solid information to the American public, the morale will be good because it feels good to be informed. And that's how I want you to feel. Like, I want you to feel that way through information. Someday I'd love to do the descriptive journalism that my grandfather did. There wasn't a big market for it when I was working in national cable news. It's one of the reasons why I stepped away. But what we need right now in journalism is just clarity about what's happening. Like, what is going on, just the facts. And so that's where we're starting with SmartHER News. And it's my hope that we add to your morale, that you enter into your weekend, for example, with your shoulders back and your chin up, feeling a little bit better about knowing what's going on in the world, a little bit smarter. Have a great weekend, guys.